Thanks a lot for joining me today to talk about reversing decisions. If you'd like to change your mind, it's I'd be way more lenient than the IPG or the MTRSA, and you can do that pretty much at any point during the seminar, which is an asset. Um, and on that arguable joke, I'd like to start with a very good example that it can take a very long time until you actually want to reverse a decision. Been there recently, actually very close to my place because I live pretty much pretty much like 2 hours away from the channel. But outside of the joke, I somehow really like that example that sometimes people realize after they did something that they actually did not want to do that, and that's basically what we're going to talk about. So I don't really have a way. I don't really have a way to know how many you are attending, but I see 92% in the Discord. So I'm not going to allow you to speak up using the mic. But however, I still would like you to speak up using the chat. A fair amount of the pedagogy that I'm trying to use is what we call reverse pedagogy, which is I'm going to ask you some questions, and you're going to answer. You're going to guess. I'm going to make some comments. I'm going to aggregate everything and try to add something clever at the end. And it's a kind of pedagogy that's that's fairly useful in terms of information retention after 2 weeks. So I would like to start with a little bit of history. Let's take an incredibly classic scenario: swamp. Mountain. Now, I would like us to project 10 years ago when there were no rules about reversing decisions. Because if we want to understand why the rules about reversing decisions are the way they are, we need to understand what the reality was before. Because the reason we put reversing decisions in the rules was a reaction to the previous situation. So it's very hard to fully understand why we're doing it that way without understanding how it was. So, and this being said, this is the first moment I'm going to need your help in your seminar. What would be the reasons to disallow a player to change their mind? So that player laid out a swamp and say, "Oh, sorry, I wanted to play that mountain." Dexterity check fail. Well, that is an assumption because, like, potentially they realized that they could do something better with the mountain. So it might not just be taking the wrong card. New information has been gained. Can you expand on this? Which new information was gained? Reading the opponent's reaction, potentially. So Greg mentions holding people to their decisions. Yes, we're going in the correct direction. Like you need to keep in mind we are 10 years ago. So you need to guess what it was 10 years ago. It might upset the opponent. Well, this is, to be fair, not really something that we are infinitely concerned with. Too much time has passed. That was not a concern. So Sherwin is asking, so are you asking if we find scenarios where we don't allow a reversal of playing the mountains? And I'm like, in the rules, and I would like to clarify, in the rules 10 years ago, why would we disallow that? Dustin says, never doing a rewind is making the judge's life much easier. They don't have to think. And you put a rolling on the floor laughing smiley, but actually this was a major argument that has been given for years. The less we allow judges to think, the more we will have a lot of consistency and fewer mistakes. Force players to be attentive while playing. Yes. So Joaquin says, because no GRV has been committed. Yes, very good. Joaquin says, everything is legal. Yes, correct. Even if you were not judging or playing 10 years ago, you can still, you can try to guess. I mean, it's a guessing exercise. But we've basically reached it. So the first major reason to disallow this is that the rules did not support changing mind. And as I mentioned in reply to Dustin, this was a major thing. Okay, so the rules don't support it, and we don't want the rules to support it because we do not want to give judges any leeway to evaluate whether that's workable or not. There was a major exception unless an infraction was committed. So either a game rule violation had been committed, or if we want to talk about the comprehensive rule, there was a section about handling illegal actions. You could note that both of those sections don't say exactly the same thing. But basically, 10 years ago, you made a mistake. You could not change it in any way. And at this point, we would go back to the argument that Greg T pointed out, which is holding people to their decisions. And that is well put, because it's important to understand that 10 years ago, Magic was still operating under some rules that were trying to define it as a sport. So the rules were pretty, I would say, punishing for players making mistakes. Right now, Magic is more of a leisure, more of a fun game. But 10 years ago, that was not really the case. Even though it was way better than 20 to 25 years ago, where making a decklist error was a disqualification, for instance. For those of you who are very recent in the program, in 1996, submitting an incorrect decklist was a disqualification. Ian is asking, so an infraction could be if someone gets a Dryad Arbor when their creature is passed to exile? Yes, definitely, but that's definitely a GRB. Yep. Okay, now let's try to figure out the reasons to say yes. 10 years ago, why would we allow this? Because sometimes we did. Mana burn still existed. So what? No, in 2000. Well, I mean, 10 years ago, it had already disappeared. But even if we're talking to like 13 to 14 years ago, where mana burn was a thing, I'm not quite sure why that might be relevant to changing mind. Any guesses? The player said the wrong name for the land they played. Potentially, but sometimes that happens. We'll see that. We'll talk about that in the next slide. That's a very good question. It was fairly quick. The opponent was the only one who gained any knowledge. So the notion of knowledge, of extra information, is very recent. It's something that is like 5 years old. Like before that, there was like nothing. A sense of humanity / common sense. Well, it's said with a tongue-out smiley, but actually, it's one of the things. It felt harsh to say no in those cases. If the action of paying the land was illegal, yes, definitely. So basically, 10 years ago, sometimes judges would say, yeah, like just change your land. So either in case of a mere dexterity error, such as Lee and Brittany Fisher mentioned, dexterity check fail, pretty much. It felt harsh to say no. It was like, well, you played your land, and the player was like, really? I realized immediately, etc. This is not fun, and like this was putting in a poor situation, and with social pressure adding, the notion of customer service 10 years ago was not nearly as developed as it is nowadays. And some judges already started realizing that disallowing a player to change their land in that very easy situation was not protecting the game's integrity, because the game integrity had never been really endangered. And so overall, the reasons to say no, to prevent a player from changing their mind, felt more objective than the reasons to say yes, which mostly revolved around like a feel bad, really a feel bad effect. It's like 10 years ago, it was like, okay, like all players need to be equal. The rules are fairly clear. If you play a card, it's played. Period. Everybody's equal. And that's and that's the general mindset of the time. But now here were some common situations which made that notion of equality struggle a lot. So just before that, Peter says, I grew up with the saying, a card laid is a card played, which is incredibly similar to the chess saying, which is if I don't have it in English, but like if you touch a piece, you need to play it. And Yeah, peace move, peace play. Yes, thanks a lot. So indeed, this was like quite the mindset back then. But now I'm going to ask four different scenarios where you can vote. Um, and you will be able to vote with emojis just below what I'm going to type. So 10 years ago, do you think we allow the player to reverse their decision if they paid mana incorrectly for casting their spell? So when I say paid mana incorrectly, I do not mean they committed a GRV. I mean that, for instance, they tapped 3 planes and 1 island for Wrath of God, but they would have liked to tap uh, 2 planes and 2 islands. Uh, Sorry, I've got a small technical issue. I am going to shut off my stream, and I will reconnect it in a couple seconds. Apologies for this. Um, I had like graphic corruption, and I quite couldn't see what was on it. So most of you voted no, and that's correct. So no, that was not a thing, obviously, unless GRV was committed. Um, Now, what if? Uh, so now, 10 years ago, did we allow a player to reverse their decision if they were not finished tapping mana for casting their spell? So everybody votes yes. Why do you think we would allow that? Still in decision-making process? Yes. And nothing is finished yet? Yes, that's correct. So indeed, for a very long time, the clear line was, oh, since the player was not finished tapping their lands, they were not finished casting their spell. Yes, even though they paused and looked at the opponent who might have had a reaction. Um, which sometimes happened and was very hard to deal with, because basically player showed a card, the opponent reacted, and then the player said, hey, I was not finished tapping my lands, and the judge always ruled, yep, you acted too fast. Next question. Did we allow a player to reverse a decision if they said mountain but played a swamp? So they verbalize the word mountain, but they physically lay out a swamp on the table. So why? So for those who say yes and no, why do you think it was the case? Could be dexterity error. Yes. You have clearly announced what you're trying to play. Yes. Intent is clear. Is it? What do you think the player intended? I don't think it's clear cut on the intent. Um, so basically, the answer back then was sometimes. Some because of the lack of guidelines, some judges would say, well, it's obvious that they wanted to play a mountain. Well, it's obvious you wanted to play a swamp since you actually put a swamp. And there were like quite some debates because, yeah, but what happens if that player does not have a mountain in hand and blah and blah and blah? And yep. So it was widely inconsistent. And on top of like inconsistency, there was not even an applicable philosophy. And now, final scenario. What if a player dropped at the same time, in a very casual way, a goblin guide and a swamp on the table? Would we allow them to reverse the decision? I never restarted my stream. Yeah, that's possible. It's good that on my slides I stick to what I'm talking about. Yep, this should be good. So Peter says DQ. I'm not sure if it's a joke or not, but if it's not, no. Okay, if it's a joke, well, still no. But it's hard for me to parse what's a joke and what's not without the when there's like no smiley. Just. Yeah, that's totally fine. But my piece of advice is so small digression. The rules of communication. There's been a study that showed that only 7% of what you try to convey is conveyed through words. The 93 other percent are either body language or intonation, which means that when you communicate in a written way, you need to add something else to your words. And that's in part why emojis got created, because they allow people to because when you put a smiley, an actual smiling smiley, you clearly show that you're happy, and so people can't get you the wrong way. Sarcasm does if you put hashtag sarcasm. That's what I'm trying to do. But anyway, this was a like small digression. So so it's very split, and indeed the answer is sometimes, because somewhere like, I mean, obviously if that player dropped a goblin guide, it's because they also wanted to drop that mountain. So obviously dexterity error. And some others were like, well, they should have thought better about that before laying out the swamp. So playing the swamp was legal, playing Goblin Guide was not. GRV for Goblin Guide in your hand. And usually when you play Goblin Guide, okay, maybe you don't really want to play swamps in your deck. That's a different topic. But you really want to cast it turn one. And the fact that, and the lack of guidelines to handle those situations was clearly putting a lot of pressure onto judges. While the goal was to remove pressure from judges by telling them the rules are saying, etc. So overall, all of this, it ended up in a questionable player experience. Basically, the judge saying, well, you cannot change your mind because you did not make a rules mistake. And to which a clever player would reply, oh, can I get a warning so I can change my mind? And I wish I were kidding when I'm saying this, but this is actually a sentence I got asked as a judge. So do you mean that I can get a warning to change my mind? Because the player didn't care about the warning, like they just wanted to change their mind. And so definitely, this was not, I would say, outstanding. And so that's why level 4 pluses started to think quite some about defining some criteria. And the very first criteria we thought about to try to determine what could constitute reasonable reversing decision was time. There are several advantages to time when it comes to implementing it in the rules. It's quantifiable and therefore it's objective. I mean, technically you can quantify time. However, perception vastly differs. If you have already investigated some miscommunication situations where you've got one player who said, hey, he clearly gave me priority. My opponent removed their hands from their attacking creatures for several seconds. And the attacking player is like, I tap my creatures and I realized nearly immediately. Very often, because they have been living in the same reality, but they had their own perception, this means that nearly immediately is as long as several seconds. And the truth is in the middle. So while time is quantifiable and objective, how can we track it? Like we could not. And even worse, many things can have happened within 1 second. And think about what I said about how we can the percentages of I mentioned about communication, like body language is incredibly important, and body language is made about reactions. So when you show a card, your opponent could have a reaction. It's a body reaction, it's instinctive reaction. They cannot do anything about it, and that is nearly immediate. So is time okay? Like, can we just allow people to like show a card and say, oh no, just to gauge what the reaction could be? This would not be sustainable. So the next thing that we thought about was the number of actions taken. In the exact same way, it's quantifiable and therefore it's objective. And it's no surprise that we first thought about time and number of actions taken, because this is in the context that I tried to describe to you about what the rules were, what we were looking for. Quantifiable, objective things cannot be disputed, very clear. Judges can safely apply. But however, we realized that sometimes non-actions happened. If I show a card and there is no reaction, what does it mean? Does it mean anything? And many things can have happened before the next action, but especially with the use of shortcuts. If I say go and nothing happens, the next action is a lot later. So how many actions were shortcut? How can we count them? So clearly, these two criteria were not sustainable. And why? Because, quoting Jean-Paul Sartre, hell is other people. While from a theoretical point of view, we could come up with something that would work very well. And if we wanted to code MTG Arena, we could totally allow people to reverse decisions based on number of actions taken. Because at this point, the software could track that. But when it comes to human beings interacting, at this point, there's a huge struggle. So rather than trying to define criteria, we realized we needed to define a guiding philosophy instead. So we realized that we wanted to define a way for a player to play the games they want to play. We did not really want to hold players to decisions they did not really want to take. But at the same time, we needed to make sure that the opponent was treated the same. Because if we were giving a privilege to the active player, we needed to be sure that this privilege was not infringing the other person's liberty. So we needed to find a real balance. So what we realized was that players are making decisions based on a game state. When you choose to cast a card or to cast a spell or activate an ability or play a card, you do it because it fits the current board state. And which means that any new decision, any decision that would replace the one you would like to cancel, should be made on the exact same game state. Many of you have been mentioning information. It's only at that point that we realized that the criteria that should be set in the rules is information. No information should have been gained if we want to have a player play the game they want to play, and B, have the opponent play the game they want to play. It needed to be fair. I see Ian typing, so I'm just going to pause for a moment for so if we are going, so Ian is asking, if we are going to allow a decision to be reversed, we should reverse it to a point where information change is minimal. So, so that's a great question. We're going to get there. Generally speaking, it's not even minimal, it's unchanged or in very specific ways. So let's try to define information, and I'm going to need your help here. What can you think about actions that could constitute new information in a game? Okay, so Guillaume is saying countering the spell. Yes, definitely. or more broadly, casting a spell. Opponent saying, I have a response or I have no response. Yes, totally. On a more vague side of things, looking at graveyard, asking about opponent's board state. Yes, indeed, that's like having a body language reaction. Definitely. So Jesse is saying, you're saying, knowing a card from your opponent's hand that they change their mind about. Can you clarify who that would apply to? Does that apply to the player trying to change their mind or to the opponent? To the opponent. Okay. Yes. So that generally speaking, that is not new relevant information, because when it comes to the player trying to change their mind, that player did not gain extra information. And when we want to ensure that the game, that the decisions are made using the same set of information, that information was already available to that player who made the decision. So that's not a criterion. So generally, as summary of what you all said, casting a spell, activating an ability, resolve or OK, proceeding to untap, which means I decline to play anything in any of the subsequent steps, because definitely the interaction of reversing decision and shortcuts can be challenging. And having a body language reaction, which could be surprise, which could be taking a look at the graveyard, as one mentioned. And now, next question. So now we've been talking about mostly actions, but what could be inaction that things that are not an active action that would still give extra information? Beyond saying pass to blockers would fall into the resolve OK category. So failure to react could indicate that they have no response. Yes. There's one other that I could think about. So the other one I had in mind is seeing an ability trigger. Like for a very classic example, I'm casting a spell. And at this point, the opponent points out that they have Eidolon of the Great River. The opponent did not do an action because it should have triggered in the rules, but nevertheless, that is a fair amount of new information. And the second one is pretty much like thinking, like I'm playing as my opponent. My opponent casts a card, and I start thinking, looking at my hand. I did not do much, if I was already looking at my hand, I didn't really have a body language reaction, but I'm thinking. So at this point, this could be treated as new information. Basically, the fact I do not say results okay real fast is potentially new information given. Okay. So fake news are dangerous. You can see that I initially wrote that presentation a couple of years ago. Not nearly as accurate these days, though. Well, except for like fake news. Like fake news are still as accurate. Maybe the means to propagate them are different, though. But definitely, sometimes if a player says okay to something that does not lead to a priority pass, such as playing a land, suspending a card, or foretelling a card, or activating companion. Well, obviously the opponent said something and they had a reaction, but that doesn't change anything. I mean, oh, dear opponent, you allowed my land to resolve. Well, thanks. Like I didn't need your permission. And at the same time, when a player is tapped out and the opponent quickly untapped, in limited or standard, what extra information was gained? Obviously, an action was performed, like lands were untapped, but at the same time, usually in standard or limited, when you're tapped out, nothing can really happen. So now we're going to try to see the. I've been trying to. We're going to try to guess the probability of gaining information. So how do you think the curve would behave depending on what I chose to call format violence? So limited is traditionally not a very violent format, and legacy is, because generally in limited you cannot win on turn one. In legacy, you can. You can think about that article about Marrow, who was defining that in standard, they expect that turn 4 is a key turn. In modern, it's turn 3, and legacy, it's turn 2. And in limited, it's sometimes turn way too many. Exponential curve up. Reasonable. Any other guesses? Logarithmic or square root? Reasonable. I agree with logarithmic or square root a bit more than exponential curve up, mostly because if we're trying to go to exponential, we're going to stop at standard pretty much. So IN is like high, low, low, moderate, high, which is not entirely what I would agree with. So for me, it's more like that. In limited, there are many reasons why gaining information is going to be rare. Most of the time, you play 14 to 16 creatures. A fair amount of the spells that you play are sorcery speed, not instant. So the potential for the opponent to react is a lot less. And also in limited, you're usually tapped out every turn. So that's why it's fairly low. And what it means is that in limited, you can actually afford being lenient on reversing decisions. On legacy, on the other hand, because of force of will, 5 minutes warning. Yeah, I'm gonna go slightly over that. Because of force of will, then you need to be a lot more cautious. Next one, probability of gaining information by numbers untapped. How would that behave? Yep, Guillaume has it. Definitely, considering that like most cards cost like 5 or less, like definitely with zero, it may with 0 runs untapped, you still have some pitch spells depending on the format. So which is why we're talking about that after format. But even in limited, with 5 lands untapped and some cards in hand, there might be an instant that could be played. Probability of gaining information by the number of unknown cards in the opponent's hand. What does that look like? No takers? 3 cards is 95% and it goes down almost. Yep. Combination is quite good. It doesn't start at 0 for the reason stated. At 3 cards, it's 95, and basically stayed there because if you keep adding cards, you still have those 3 unknown cards, so it cannot go down actually. But basically, what this means is that you don't need to. It's not big. What you need to keep in mind is that if a player has 7 cards in hand, they most likely have 3 to 4 lands because of the way Magic is played. There's just a point where you stop playing your lands and you keep them to bluff, even though at some point everybody knows that half of your hand is pretty much lands. So from the moment there are 3 cards, there's already like a lot of information to be gained. 3 unknown cards. And now probability of gaining information by time elapsed. And I'm aware that I'm asking this while I certainly described that it's very hard to know how much time passed. This has to increase sharply as time goes on. Well, to me, it increases like in a fairly linear way. One could make the case that from 2 to 3 seconds, we're already at 95%. That's possible. But basically, the reason I put that is while I said that time is not an outstanding criteria to put in the rules, I wanted to say this might be something that you want to consider if a player asks you, can I reverse that decision? So moving on to the conclusion of this. The notion of reversing decisions is not a right that a player has, it's a privilege. As a judge, you must be certain that no extra information was gained to allow a player to change their mind. But you do not need to prove that any information was gained to disallow it. Basically, if you doubt, leave as is. If you are not sure that this is safe, then you can hold the player to, hey, you made that move, you should have anticipated that before making that move. And this is clearly the way the MTR are phrased. Like, take a look at that wording. The way this wording is phrased is clearly saying the default is no reversing decisions. But if you're sure that it's safe, go ahead. Small story that I'll summarize real quick. If a player starts revealing information at the table to argue that this information was revealed, it does not qualify as information being revealed. Basically, if a player in front of you says, oh, but this clearly means that I've got that counter spell in my hands, yes, they just revealed information. However, at this point, it's just as if they had shown the card. It does not qualify as having been revealed. It's a situation that I've encountered at a Pro Tour where a player basically started to explain to me why my decision sucked because this, and to which I replied, I mean, if you want to have that discussion, maybe we should go away because I think that you are revealing information now, but that is not going to change my ruling at all. And finally, and that's something that is a bit counterintuitive, so I'll spend 1 or 2 minutes to explain it. If you would allow a player to reverse a decision, and by reversing that decision, it could allow a trigger to go on the stack, then the player may say, oh, and my ability triggers. And the reasons for that are that the mistrigger policy is not a gotcha game. The mistrigger policy is here so that the opponent does not need to point out a trigger that was missed or likely forgotten. So if a player is like, oh, and I cut this, hey, wait, I don't want to cut this, I would like this to trigger, that is fine. Do you have any questions on this? If you've got more questions, I mean, you can definitely write in the chat, and I can expand a little bit more. That's like totally fine by me. But meanwhile, so as to leave room to the next person in line. So if you want to learn some more about reversing decisions, I've got a blog. Name is What's Up Docs, and there's like more than 80 articles, not about all about reversing decisions, but there are like comprehensive articles on that topic on it. So thanks a lot for attending. I sincerely hope that, so first, it was interesting, and two, in 15 days, you will remember at least part of it. That's what I tried. Thanks for participating as well, like a lot. I think it's I think those presentations are what makes the quality of my presentations is actually your contributions. Because I could be speaking all along, but when I'm able to comment on what you're saying, that also allows me to expand on like potential misconceptions, which I couldn't necessarily anticipate. So before I'm going into extra time, thanks a lot, and enjoy the rest of the conference, and have a great evening. Take care.